Back. This is the Democratic Constitution podcast. My name is Lucas DeHart, and my co-host here is Luke Pickrell. Today, we are going to take a deep dive a little bit into the origins of modern democratic republicanism in the American Revolutionary period. So, because of that, this episode will primarily deal with Thomas Paine.
Yeah, hi everyone. So, I'll introduce us a little bit to Tom Paine. Tom Paine was born in England in 1737, and his father was a Quaker. And because of that, his father instilled in him values of equality and also opposition to social hierarchy. Paine was exposed to a lot of things early in life before he came to the United States. He was exposed to class inequality and class conflict in Britain, and that experience developed in him an understanding of social ills and also social conflict. He also read John Locke, and it was through John Locke that he learned about natural rights theory, the idea that natural rights trump divine rights. The existing society was, of course, based on the idea of divine rights. He observed that legitimacy should come from consent, the consent of the people. And he also came to believe that the people have a right to rebel against unlawful or oppressive authority. That's all going to become very relevant. So Paine arrives in America in 1775, and according to Harvey, Kaye, who wrote a very excellent biography of Paine, at this time Enlightenment thought and also evangelical Protestantism had already seeped into the colony and had shaped a lot of the colonial culture. Those two intellectual traditions then, and this is a quote from Kaye, those two intellectual traditions strove to remove barriers to sight and to bring bright light to darkness, especially to intellectual darkness. And both of those traditions rejected inherited wisdom as the basis of knowledge. Again, that was the foundation of the present society. And it also encouraged the questioning of, and if not just sort of the downright resistance to, the present authority. At the same time, though, despite these radical ideas that are bubbling, it is still commonly believed that a limited monarchy should be the form of government. And while there is some growing opposition to King Charles III, events are sort of stagnant, if you will. And Americans continue to think and operate in terms of king, constitution, and the mother country, as Harvey Keane puts it. So Paine comes ashore, and he comes ashore into this environment, and he goes on to author some of the most famous political works in modern history. And he actually says that the cause of America was what made him an author in the first place. He wasn't really much of an author prior to arriving to the United States. Again, Kaye writes that Paine sensed that the time for revolutionary action had arrived, and that Paine actually didn't believe the pronouncements that he heard of love for king, constitution, and mother country, that those sentiments really represented how folks in the colony felt. Paine didn't actually believe that. Common Sense, then, perhaps one of the works that Paine is most well known for, is published in 1776, and it sells the equivalent of 15 million copies today, which would actually make it proportionally the nation's greatest bestseller ever. In Common Sense, Paine argues that all government is or ought to be calculated for the general good and the safety of the community. That's a quote from the work. He argues also that the very structure and character of Britain's political and social order was illegitimate because it did not provide for the colonists' well-being. He also argues that checks and balances and a constitution based on checks and balances is just totally bunk. And the reason it is bunk is because it provides only for really the rule of one, that being the king, and the few, that being the aristocracy over the many. And Kaine is a Democrat, and so he does not go for this. Instead, argues that the state actually belongs to the whole people, not the crown, not to the aristocracy, and that the only people who could really understand what was good for the country was the people. And reading Common Sense, you just really get a sense of it being saturated with these ideas of universal human rights. And Paine is also really investigating this idea of where inequality comes from. And he argues that it's actually inequality and not equality that needs to be explained. And he says the only reason for inequality is the actual imposition of force and fraud upon people.
Yeah, so as we carry on, at the time, many colonists actually argued that the time wasn't right to break with England. Jonathan Israels, in his great book, The Expanding Blaze, really explains how the period between 1763 and the actual beginning of the war, 1775, that period was really the period of the consciousness growth of the American colonists at the time. That was the real revolution of the American colonists at the time. Critics spread fear and doubt and argued that Americans couldn't sustain a republic. All our property is a quote from a naysayer at the time. All our property throughout the continent would be unhinged. The greatest confusion and the most violent convulsions would take place, warned one naysayer. Paine had none of that, foreshadowing Martin Luther King Jr.'s understanding that wait has almost always meant never, and that the time to act for democracy is always now. Paine argued that Americans were ripe for revolution and republicanism, in his words, democratic republicanism. Naysayers' fears were only chimeras, empty and unreal fancies of excited minds. Furthermore, all men are Republicans by nature and Royalists only by fashion.
Yeah. So the war begins, and soon after the war begins, Paine helps write one of the new state constitutions. All the states are suddenly having to create these new documents to figure out how to run their society. Paine helps write the new Pennsylvania Constitution. The Pennsylvania Constitution temporarily becomes the sole unicameral and near democratic constitution to exist in the new revolutionary period, and really the most democratic constitution to exist in the world at the time. One of the things that Paine argues is that the more complex a government is, the greater threat that government actually poses to democracy. Complexity dilutes or blocks democracy. Simplicity vitalizes, energizes democracy. And for that reason, then no government can be too simple in Paine's mind. America, right, Paine is arguing it needs a plain and a straightforward government. And concretely, what that means is it needs just a single House of Representatives. Again, none of this bicameral stuff. He writes in The Rights of Man, and this is a quote, that by integrating representation upon democracy, we arrive at a system of government capable of embracing and confederating all of the various interests and every extent of territory and population. So it's a full-throated democratic argument. Jonathan Israel, a famous historian who writes about this period, correctly notes that there are radicals in Europe who critiqued the Pennsylvania Constitution for failing to abolish slavery and failing to end racial discrimination. The new Pennsylvania Constitution also fails to safeguard the rights of Native Americans, and it really doesn't do too much in terms of protecting press freedom. Despite those drawbacks, I really think we have to recognize the Pennsylvania Constitution as the most democratic document of its time, and especially because of its democratic structural provisions. And the key one that I know I keep hammering home, but that key one is that single legislative assembly.
Yeah. So following the revolution, a debate raged between two schools of thought, essentially, about Republican government, between the Democratic Republicans, like Tom Paine and Benjamin Franklin, and the aristocratic Republicans, who believed in mixed government, like James Madison and John Adams. And John Adams famously calls Paine a poor, ignorant, malicious, short-sighted, crapulous mass. Over how much, and he says, over how much say the ordinary people should have in a new government. So Paine advocated for a democratic republic, in which sovereignty would lie in a unicameral legislature with representative elected by universal and equal suffrage. Again, universal and equal suffrage. His opponents feared universal and equal suffrage and sought a mixed constitution with checks and balances that divided power between two legislative houses, a veto-wielding executive and an unelected federal judiciary. So, in response to common sense, John Adams famously wrote Thoughts of Government and presented precisely these points and ideas. Aristocratic republicanism won out, and the new federal constitution created a republic that was explicitly not a democracy. The Constitution of 1787 was a defeat for democratic republicanism and unicameralism, and a victory for monarchical republicanism and a mixed government containing many of the minoritarian checks we know today. At the blog, we just wrote up an agitational piece about judicial review, and that came into being by the Supreme Court in 1803 with Marbury v. Madison.
So the war ends, and Paine is recognized as having a very important role, perhaps not the important role that he recognizes or that he totally deserved. He's given something of a pension to live on, but he ends up leaving America after the war, and he travels to England. And it's in England that he publishes The Rights of Man, another seminal work. He publishes Rights of Man in 1791, and he does so to defend the French Revolution against Edmund Burke. According to Eric Foner and E.P. Thomspon, two very well-regarded historians, that text, Rights of Man, becomes a fundamental track for the English working class. It has a very, very long afterlife. And it's in the Rights of Man that Paine is arguing the cause of political democracy is inseparable from the economic demands of the poor, and that the solution to poverty is democratic government. So this is a very explicitly political argument, saying that these social problems that you have can only be solved by changing your government into a democracy. He's really hammering that point home. He also defends the rights of people, again, to change their constitutions. And this is a well-known quote from Paine. He says that I am, Paine, contending for the rights of the living against their being willed away and controlled and contracted for by the manuscript assumed authority of the dead. The manuscript assumed authority being the folks who have written some existing constitution, saying you can change that. You have the duty, if you will, to change that. So democratic constitutions, he's also arguing, create prosperous societies. And this is another famous quote from him. It's a little longer. Paine says, when these things can be said, then that country can boast its constitution, can boast of its constitution and of its government. Paine gets in a lot of trouble for writing this work. If I'm remembering correctly, he has to flee England. He's tried in absentia and convicted of treason. If he returns to England, he's dead, essentially, and he flees to France. And it's there that in 1795 he publishes the Dissertations on the First Principles of Government, a smaller text, perhaps not as well known as some of these other ones. And it's in First Principles that he explains, and this is another quote, that the true and the only true basis of representative government is equality of rights. He's arguing here that universal and equal suffrage, that's and this is another quote, the primary right by which other rights are protected, and that to take away that right is to reduce someone to slavery. And that's because in Paine's mind, slavery consists in being subject to the will of another. And as he says, the he that has not a vote in the election of representatives is in this case. So he that does not have a universal and an equal vote to elect representatives is essentially a slave.
Yeah. So later on, Paine dies in New York City in 1809. Well before the end of his life, he developed a very potent critique of the unfettered accumulation of property. Now, that's not to say he's for the abolition of property. He's not a socialist. He argued that the principle of universal and equal rights overrode the particular claim to private property. if the ownership and concentration of property resulted in the domination of the many by the few. Private property rights must be subordinated to the common good. Liberty consists in the freedom to do everything which injures no one else. Hence, the exercise of the natural rights of each man has no limits, except those which assure to the other members of society the enjoyment of the same rights. Paine's democratic republicanism didn't win out in the US. Unicameralism simply wasn't popular. The idea of America as a democratic republic was an idea whose time had not yet come. Mixed government and separation of powers, writes Gordon Wood, persuaded most post-revolutionary politically engaged pamphlet and newspaper reading Americans that their political and legal institutions approached perfection. With the federal constitution secured by late 1787, little more, many believed, was required. Hence, anti-democratic discourse in the press and legislators remained broadly prevalent as the United States until after 1800. So between 1775 and about 1820, those dissatisfied with the combat had to combat a profoundly ingrained bias that America's political order possessed a degree of perfection that only a fringe was prepared publicly to claim it had not achieved.
Right. So Paine is dead. Democratic Republican ideas are sort of on the run, if you will. The French Revolution, many would argue, has been overthrown. There's something of an aristocratic backlash against the success of a more democratic strand within the American Revolution and the French Revolution. But these ideas of democratic republicanism that have been found in Paine and that we've talked about, they don't go away. They just stick around, and we can locate them in other folks. And I'm going to talk about a few of those. One of those folks is Thomas Skidmore. Thomas Skidmore, an American, he's co-founder and leader of the Working Men's Party in New York City in the late 1820s. And he's a real admirer of Tom Paine's. His most famous book, The Rights of Man to Property, and you'll notice The Rights of Man to Property, the title is really no accident, extends Paine's arguments around the subordination of property to universal rights, which we talked about and which were outlined in The Rights of Man, and also a text called Agrarian Justice. And Skidmore's book depicts a two-class society, takes those ideas of Paine, uses them to look at society, and sees a two-class society consisting of a property ruling class and then also a propertyless majority that is inevitably subjected to a sort of economic slavery that makes true liberty impossible. So what Skidmore is doing is looking at a more advanced capitalist society. He's looking at a society that Paine could not see. Paine was not living then, but he's applying Paine's ideas. And out of applying those ideas, he's abhorred to see the subordination of those universal and equal rights to the right to property, the accumulation of property. What does Skidmore do? Well, he actually advocates for a constitutional convention that would abolish debt, it would end the right of inheritance, and it would bring about an equal distribution of productive and personal property. It would actually gather all property together in one point and then disseminate it out to everyone within New York. Karl Marx actually read about Skidmore and the American working men's parties in the summer of 1843, and it's a whole other conversation, but that view into America had a big impact on Marx, and he did some important, though flawed, again, another story, some important but flawed writings around that particular issue. Natural rights theory also greatly influences the English Chartists, who we've written about previously. The Chartists were England's most significant political movement in the 19th century. And Marx and Engels, particularly though Engels, really comes to appreciate democracy's radical potential by observing the Chartists and engaging with their 6 demands that they have. Paine's natural rights theory and his opposition to slavery later on also influences the American abolitionist movement. And to take a few of the things that Paine actually said about slavery, soon after arriving in America, he called slavery a wicked practice. And he argued in the Rights of Man that man has no property in man, no right to property in man. So taking those ideas, plus a lot of other stuff, William Lloyd Garrison launches his newspaper, famously The Liberator, in 1831 in Boston. And he actually places a version of Paine's words on the paper's masthead. And the masthead of Garrison's paper reads, "Our country is the world, our countrymen are mankind." And that's a play on what Paine said in The Rights of Man when he wrote that the world is my country, all mankind are my brethren, and to do good is my religion.
Now, to take us a bit more into the future, about 100 years ago, a little more, founded in 1901, the Socialist Party of America, SPA, made a great deal of Paine and his democratic republicanism. Historian Harvey Kaye wrote that during socialist Sunday schools, one teacher portrayed Paine, not the aristocratic Washington, as the real father of our country. In The Masses, a widely read socialist paper, one author placed Paine in dialogue with the likes of God, Satan, Voltaire, Mary Wollstonecraft, Mark Twain, and even Vladimir L. Lenin. The radical sociologists in the 50s and 60s, C. Wright Mills, admired Paine, and according to Kaye, wanted to be Paine. Tom Hayden, one-time president of Students for Democratic Society and the author in 1962 of the Port Huron Statement, was also a great admirer of Paine. And so, as we can see, and I've spoken of timelines a lot. Like, I look at this timeline of modern democratic republicanism. Really, there is a period slightly before the American Revolutionary period, but I think it's best to look at this timeline as going from that revolutionary period. Tom Paine is this very unique figure, I think. Not that there aren't other Democratic Republicans. Of course there are. And there were those that were the actual, for sure we can say, writers of the state constitution of Pennsylvania. But Paine had such an influence going forward. I can't think of very many Democratic Republicans that we've studied that don't use not only him as inspiration, but also his works and his writing to further develop their democratic republicanism, going through, of course, as we said, the French revolutionaries, Chartists, the 1848 revolutions in Europe, Lenin, through the civil rights movement, the anti-war movement, SDS, its ideology is of democratic republicanism, even if not in so many words, always. And I just think it's really important to understand that period to get us to where we are today, what we're talking about for an American democratic constitution today. There's more talk about it than there's been in 100 years. And he continues to be this extremely influential figure.
Yeah. And I'll close out by issuing a correction. I said it was King George III who was who was king when the U.S. Was raging its Revolutionary War. It was not. It was King George III. So King George. As Lucas said, Paine, though not born in America, is a seminal American figure. And lo and behold, that seminal American figure, Tom Paine, happens to be an intransigent Democrat and happens to be, if he were alive today, totally opposed, I believe, to the existing political structure that we have. If we sort of imagine Paine, I don't know how, but Paine comes back to life. He is existing in the United States. We can think of all the things that he would be opposed to. One, some sort of, and perhaps it's waning, but a deification or a sanctification of the Constitution is something that is perfect and should not be changed or altered very little. That totally cuts against Paine's idea that politics is about change and that people have not only the ability but the right, based on a theory of politics, to change their government when it's not working for them. And a government not working for the people, I think that exemplifies or describes very well the existing government that we have in the United States. So when the government cannot take care of its citizens, it is illegitimate. And by that reasoning, the people have the right to overthrow that government and create something better in its place. Very much describes what I believe folks in the United States have the right and the duty to do in our country faced with our particular Constitution. I also think, and this sort of touches on the question of property and private property, that Paine would be totally opposed to the development of capitalism as we've seen it in the United States. Paine was writing at a particular time. Capitalism had not really developed in the United States. And if he were to exist in the society we have today, where the right to property is one sanctified to such an extent that it trumps those universal and equal rights, trumps all else essentially, that would just totally cut across everything that we've talked about in terms of the universal and equal rights being above that right to property, and the right of property being subordinated and being illegitimate, again, if it should, like a government, in any way harm the people, destroy the ability to exist, so on and so forth. So there's a lot to be said about Tom Paine. We've only covered some of the works on him, and an article that we'll write about Paine for the blog will actually have a list of references that you can refer to. I'll close just by saying I think a little bit of a quote that I actually stumbled upon by John Dos Passos. John Dos Passos, a very famous American writer, actually wrote something about Tom Paine, it turns out. And Dos Passos basically says that in times of change, when things are in flux, when fear is something of a quicksand in men's minds, as he said, it can help to have a bridge or a lifeline that connects to the past and helps us deal with the very scary present. And so I really think, and of course it's what we talk about on the blog, that the work of Tom Paine, really hammering home his intransigent advocacy for universal rights and a unicameral legislature, that history, especially because it's coming from an American, can serve as a beacon of hope, if you will, can certainly be a very valuable point of understanding for us as we go and try to do what Tom Paine wanted to do, which was to create an actual democracy in this country.
Yeah. Again, thank you guys for listening or watching, if that's what you're doing. I hope if you haven't followed the blog or haven't followed the podcast on Spotify, Twitter, YouTube, please do so. We really appreciate people giving us feedback. And have a good one. Thank you.